Finding items from the 1800s from the Democratic Party from Minnesota is very difficult to do, and so in my 42 years plus collecting, I've only accumulated one small frame of things, but some very nice ribbons from conventions and some congressional district ribbons and a couple governor ribbons. But
my friends, if you're an active Minnesota Democrat and you attend the local and state DFL conventions, you've most likely seen, met, talked to Paul Bankston. For 42 years, Paul has been collecting history, and I mean history. It is the history of Minnesota and the nation's political campaigns and personalities. He's collected their buttons, postcards, mementos, even special license plates. These lit drop cards are from last year's election. Paul Bankston, the first time I met you was at one of the district or the state convention, I'm not sure which, and I stood there and talked to you for a very long time.
I do remember.
What you had displayed blew me away. How many buttons, just buttons, do you have in your collection?
I stopped counting at about 30,000, so I would guess about 40 or 45,000 now.
That's astonishing. Obviously, you don't have displayed 30 or 45,000 buttons.
No.
Because I'm assuming a lot of them are really quite valuable at this point.
Yes.
They go back so far. How do you maintain them? How do you keep them? Categorize them?
Usually categorized by candidate, but certain ones that are over a certain value, unfortunately, get kept in the safety deposit box, so they come out for rare occasions like today. My best political button is one I just got last week. It's from 1901. Teddy Roosevelt had just become president because of the assassination of McKinley.
Yes.
And one of his very early acts was to invite Booker T. Washington to dinner, thus making him the first African American to ever
to be a dinner guest at the White House.
That's right. It created just a political firestorm for him in the South.
I would imagine.
And so they came out with two versions of this pin. This pin is the Northern Republican version, which is pro, and then the anti-version shows Teddy Roosevelt holding a bottle of wine and them both drinking, and sort of a caricaturized version of Booker T. Washington, suggesting that they're getting drunk together.
What's amazing about this button and the word equality is that was 1901.
1901. And Teddy Roosevelt took a brave step by doing this, and he knew it going into it that this was going to be quite a political statement.
Do you have any specifics on the firestorm you say that came over him from the South?
Well, it lit up the newspapers. Of course, that was the main form of communication, and so most of the newspapers at that time were either owned by Democrats or Republicans. They were political tools of the party, and so they just went hog wild with either pro or anti-sentiments, Southern and Northern.
Of course, yes. Let's take a look at a videotape shot. I think it was in March at the CD3 District Convention where you were in full regalia.
1960 is kind of an interesting year for Hubert Humphrey. He had burst onto the national scene in 1948 by giving his civil rights speech at the 48 Democratic National Convention. He was elected senator. He was re-elected in 1954, and then in 1960 he's up for re-election as senator, but he's also seriously running as a presidential candidate. He ends up sort of butting heads with this young man named John Kennedy. Kennedy, of course, eventually wins the nomination, but Humphrey buttons from 1960 just about all say, "It's Humphrey in 60, it's Humphrey in 60." And the campaign designed them that way so that if he didn't get the presidential nomination, they could reuse the buttons for his Senate campaign. And the Humphrey campaign put these Kennedy for Senator buttons out sort of as anti-John Kennedy pins. They're basically saying, keep him senator, he's not ready for the presidency. Very young picture of Eugene McCarthy. Very handsome man in his young days. Kind of a fun one right here with Rudy Perpich on a donkey with a sword. Perpich was quite often called Goofy, and so the Perpich campaign took that as a badge of honor and said, you know, I'm Goofy for Perpich. They didn't shy away from that label. Lots of interesting pins, and as you can see here, These are the precursor to what we now know as bumper stickers. And these are called license plates attachments. Before they had stickers, you would actually bolt these to the back of your Model T or Model A.
This is not buttons. This is the history of America, in many instances, the history of Minnesota.
They started making buttons in 1896, so you can really tell the entire history of the 20th century with buttons. There's a button for almost any event: the Spanish-American War, the women's rights movements, women's suffrage.
I still have all my buttons from the ERA,
yeah,
which
ERA,
we never got, the Equal Rights Amendment.
I'm
still not over that, by the way.
The Civil Rights Movement from the
yes.
From the 60s and up, and all of these things.
Let's just point to some of these.
Sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt
That's
you.
right.
Remember San Juan Hill. Of
Sure.
course, there's Teddy Roosevelt.
Right.
This must have been a campaign button.
That's actually for him running for governor when he has come back.
Oh my goodness
from
sakes.
San
Of
Juan
course.
Hill. Right.
This is crazy. I have all my Hillary buttons, but she's as bad as she wants to be with her funky hairdo.
Well, and it's Hillary Rodham Clinton, and so remember she announced
Dennis Rodman!
She wanted to be referred
For
to
Pete's
as Hillary Rodman, so they're making fun of her in this.
Yeah,
And so
that
that's sort of
would have been a Republican thing.
Sure, and she's as bad as she wants to be. And
That's
so
right, because when she and the president took over the White House, she was Hillary Rodham.
Right.
And the Republicans made such a fuss
Right.
that eventually she became Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Right.
And I understood it was a political move, but that's another thing I'm still irritated about. How dare they, give it a break.
A lot of these things, it's popular culture sort of spilling in.
These are very interesting because they're dimensional. Kick out depression with a Democratic vote, bring back prosperity with a Republican vote.
Prosperity, yeah. These are both from 1932.
Sure,
We're in the heat
Depression.
of the Depression. And so this is the Democratic version, and you pull the donkey and it kicks the elephant, and here's the Republican version. You pull
literally,
the elephant.
you can see the,
Sure.
oh sure, and
It's
I don't know if the legs actually are articulated,
Yes,
you can see
they
here.
move. And so
These are valuable.
sure,
Good grief,
sure.
isn't this fun?
yeah, they're very, very cool.
Carter talks in Playboy. Oh my
Again,
goodness.
another instance of popular culture getting into history.
Is that when he
He
was
said
so
it-
chastised?
he-
I lust in my mind.
Lust in my mind. Sure.
And people went nuts.
Yep.
Like no man in America had ever lusted in their mind, and Jimmy Carter was the first.
Well, no one running for president had ever admitted to it.
Yeah, right. It's because, of course, he's not a human being. Yeah, exactly.
And so a lot of these things are popular culture.
This-
Here's Gerald Ford looking like Fonzie. He's wearing a leather coat.
Oh, for
And then you
Pete's
remember
sakes.
Gerald Ford had the win buttons. With
Yes.
inflation now,
Yes.
you'd get at your grocery store, and he's wearing a win button, and he's got the Fonzie thumbs up. So happy days are here again.
Good look.
And then-
For President Franklin D.
Right, and then we've got the V for victory. So this is from 1944, when we're in the midst of World War II.
And obviously, Sockatoon Bobby is Bobby Kennedy.
Bobby
But
Kennedy.
Sock it to them refers directly to Laugh-In.
The Laugh-In.
Sock it to me.
Yeah.
Boom, and
So
somebody
these,
said,
yeah, these are all cases of popular culture kind of finding their way into it.
but this is really something.
That is really something. That is a 1864 Abraham Lincoln campaign ribbon.
Goodness
Unusual in that in 1864 he had a beard, and this one shows a beardless. It's probably the printer just using an old
Really?
printing block that
Really?
they had, sure.
And this is a silk ribbon.
It's a very,
amazingly
very thin.
intact.
Yeah, very, very thin. Found in a Bible in Pennsylvania.
Really?
Sure.
Really?
Yeah, there's about
Vice President Andrew Johnson, Peace Commissioners Ulysses S. Grant.
That's
Not
right.
for long.
Not for long.
Not
That's
for
right.
long.
Yeah.
And Sherman, of course, and Sheridan. Is there one that is the most humorous?
There's one from 1960 from it was worn at the Democratic and the Republican National Convention by the prostitutes. And it says, prostitutes for Kennedy or Nixon, we don't care who gets in.
Say that again
Prostitutes,
slowly.
Prostitutes for Kennedy or Nixon, we don't care who gets in.
I would love to have that button.
It's kind of rare.
Oh, I bet it is.
And then from the 1940 campaign, when Franklin Roosevelt was running for the third term, there are lots of buttons that say things like "No man is good 3 times," or Roosevelt's answer to that was 1 time good, 2 time really good, 3 time damn good. And so they have sort of a sexual.
I'm fascinated by the double entendres
yeah.
going back that far. That was really risque.
Pretty risque, yeah.
Where do you find all of these remarkable things?
Well, collecting has really changed since eBay. So, I mean, in the early days, it was by going to conventions and picking them up at the conventions, going to the state fair every election year and going to the booths, going to antique shops, flea markets, estate sales, garage sales. Hitting the road, putting in lots of miles, going from town to town to town, hitting every antique shop you could, as many as you could in a day. Nowadays, that doesn't work so well. I've been doing it still, but the amount of success is much limited. And it's really on eBay and Craigslist where most of this stuff is found now.
Has that forced the prices up?
No, it's had sort of the opposite effect. In cases of anything that's common or uncommon, the prices have actually fallen. The rarer items, more unusual items, have held their value or increased.
You've done this for so very long. What was the first spark? What made you decide, I'm going to do this, and then you got deeper and deeper and deeper?
This pin here is the very rarest of all Humphrey pins.
The spark is clear. I was a young boy, and my parents dragged the family out to Waverly, Minnesota, to hear a guy named Hubert Humphrey, who was there. I think he had just gotten back from accepting the nomination at the Democratic National Convention, or he might have been just on his way to, I don't recall which. And it wasn't so much what he said as the excitement of the town that day. That little town was just bubbling.
And he created that.
He created that, sure.
Rare.
Yeah,
he was rare.
And he got up and gave this speech and the cheers, and they were selling buttons that day. And so I spent my allowance on 2 buttons and went home and pinned them up on my curtain, and that just snowballed from there.
This is a real neat piece because it always reminds me how some things never change. A brochure for Hubert Humphrey running for senator. The rich get richer thanks to GOP tax law. And there's many pieces in my collection that just remind me that as far as we've come, just certain things never change. The slogans and the policy sometimes remain the same.
Yeah. Paul, what you have done is so important. You are a historian for us. Bravo for you. Friends, thanks so much for being with us here on Democratic Visions. I'm Nancy Nelson, sitting in for Tim O'Brien. I do hope you'll join me every Monday through Friday from 5 to 6 o'clock on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, right there on your radio dial. And I want to tell all of the wonderful volunteers here, and especially Jeff Straight, the work you do here for all of us who care about the progressive world in Minnesota is absolutely invaluable. I am so pleased you let me be a part of it.
Democratic Visions is handcrafted by volunteers through DFL Senate District 48, Eden Prairie, and Minnetonka. Sharon Boreen, Chair.